So my question, Louis, to kick off. Obviously, we're in the COVID-19, a pretty unique situation at the moment. How is this similar and different to other kind of economic downturns that you've seen, and what do you think the impact's going to be on the property market?
Yeah, right. So this is pretty unprecedented for anybody. It's the first time I've lived through something like this, and yourself as well. I'm sure Boz and probably anybody else who's listening to us today would have to say the same, because the last time I guess the world went through something of a health crisis like this was 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. And I guess there's two different things playing out at the moment. There's obviously the health crisis, and obviously even the case of the Spanish flu. It's very hard to draw parallels. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then obviously there's also the economic and financial side of this that's kind of hit pretty hard in the last couple of weeks, and I think has become apparent to a lot of people. And I guess from that side of things, perhaps there are similarities from a financial perspective to other financial episodes that we've lived through, where there is normally a bit of a shock happens often in the share market as well as financial markets. So we see that obviously availability of credit normally would dry up. In this case, that's actually not happening. And I've actually wondered recently whether the GFC that obviously we went through and had a huge impact on the world's economy 12 or so years ago, whether that was like the warm-up that allowed the central banks around the world to kind of understand what tools they had at their disposal. And obviously a lot of people ask, is this going to be like the Great Depression? And I guess people need to understand as well, in the history of financial markets, that are in the Great Depression, there weren't central banks that were coordinating in a way that they are now. In fact, the role of the central bank came out as a result of the Great Depression largely. But certainly the way that central banks and governments have acted to shore up liquidity was incredible how quickly that happened, and that gave a lot of confidence, I guess, to investors. Probably the other thing is I mentioned to you before we started today that if I start to get too nerdy and you want me to dial it down, Boz, just let me know.
Maybe just keep it simple. Some executive summary kind of similarities.
Yes.
Differences.
Sorry, I'm losing you again there. You're just dropping in.
Everyone's on their Netflix at 7:30 at night, draining the internet.
That's right. So keep it simple. So the similarities obviously are, yes, there's going to be a shock to I guess confidence, or there has been a shock to confidence. That's one big similarity. The other that's a very stark contrast is that liquidity isn't going to be an issue. And in terms of what started the GFC, it was a downward spiral of debt deleveraging in the US. So that kind of means that lenders obviously were nervous about borrowers' capacity to repay them. So they started selling assets. And this is actually, if I draw a connection between the GFC and the Great Depression, it was actually a very similar thing. The Great Depression started with the share market crash. Lenders started to sell assets because they were worried about prices going down further. So lenders started to sell assets, which then forced down the price of the remaining assets in the market, which meant that other lenders all of a sudden started getting nervous and making their borrowers sell assets again. So it created this downward spiral. Same thing happened in the GFC, where lenders in the US got nervous. They started doing forced sales, which pushed down the value, which resulted in more lenders doing forced sales, pushing down value. And that was mostly what we saw in the US. It didn't quite play out the same way, certainly not in residential markets in Australia. In commercial markets and the share market it did, but the residential market was well insulated from that. This time around, I guess one difference is, yes, commercial markets and the share market have been really strongly impacted because of the concerns people have around earnings in the future. So rents are drying up for commercial landlords. Office buildings like this are sitting mostly vacant, and tenants are saying, well, why should I pay rent if I'm not actually in there? And similarly in shopping centres, it's the same. But the residential market's held up really well. And what we've also seen is that banks have come to the party and said, hey, we're going to give people a mortgage holiday. So we're going to give them time. If they're unable to pay through this period, we'll just push it back and we'll go into hibernation. The government similarly come to the party and said, hey, we'll pay people enough to make sure that everyone can at least put food on the table and get through this period of hibernation with money in the bank and come out the other side and hopefully rev up the economy. So this is almost a once in a lifetime situation that we're seeing. And I know definitely in Australia, the way the policymakers have responded has been really impressive, kind of ticking all the boxes that you'd want to have ticked. And the outcome of that is that there's not going to be any forced sales, or if there are, it won't be many, because pretty much everyone who owns a house at the moment with a mortgage in Australia is going to be able to ride through to after this crisis has ended. So that's obviously one great thing. And it also isn't a crisis resulting from an oversupply of anything. There's not an oversupply of housing in Australia like there was in the GFC in the US. There isn't an oversupply of, of workers at the moment. So I think it's a unique situation. It's obviously very scary, and certainly when people are seeing their incomes dropping and all the talk in the media, understand why people have really dialed into this and want to know what the future might hold. But I think that's a really important thing to understand, is what's happening in the supply demand side, and the fact that the lenders aren't foreclosing. There's not going to be forced sales. There's not going to be a downward spiral of deleveraging, not just in Australia, but it looks similar around other parts of the world.
Yeah, no doubt. It's I think I've had the conversation 7 times today, and probably 10 times a day for each day for the last couple of weeks. The media obviously have a field day with with fear and emotion, and I thought it'd be just a really good opportunity. As you said, there's not going to be a mass sell-off for the reasons that you talked about. But I know that I've seen the headline, property prices will drop 20%, as a result of this thing. So a few things just to give everyone some context on what that means. Firstly, the only metric with regards to house prices that are measured is the median. Now, the median is not an average, it is the middle value in a range of sales. So there's not one property market. And not all properties react and behave in the same way through, growth phases and downturns. And so, I guess effectively what we see is, even though the median might come backwards, and the median came back by about 10% in the GFC when there wasn't the kind of economic stimulus and protection that the government's providing. That didn't mean that every property lost 10% of its value. It doesn't mean that every property would lose 20% of its value if the crystal ball reporters are correct. So it's really important to understand and put into context what those kind of comments mean. If the median comes back by whatever it is, 10 or 20%, okay, then what that means is it's a recalibration of the middle value. And it just means that there are fewer sales happening above the median, relatively more sales happening below the median, so the middle value shifts this way. So I think more than ever, it's really important for people to be understanding and crystal clear on what the different investing strategies are out there, and specifically how they can mitigate risk through the downturns and take advantage of the upturns, which I'm sure we'll get some questions about. What do you think property's going to do on the other side of this COVID-19 thing?
While you're on it, Boz, you mentioned about what's factored into the median and what impacts the median in terms of why it might drop. So one of those things you mentioned was obviously fewer houses selling above a median, fewer expensive properties in suburbs might be selling. Why do you think that might be?
Just uncertainty. If there's no doubt that unemployment will rise through this thing. So someone that might be thinking of outlaying, $800,000, $900,000 or $1 million or more, probably going to sit on their hands until there's a bit more certainty and security.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that? I mean, I saw or read a report the other day. There were 450,000 property transactions last year, and that the forecast is that that's going to be a lot less. Obviously, the majority of those are transactions of established houses, not of new products getting built, because new is a fraction of that. what proportion of those do you think? Because obviously the downsizer market has really been active in selling some of those more expensive houses in the last few years. So I imagine as well they might not put their properties on the market through this uncertain time. How else do you think uncertainty might play out with that market?
Well, I guess the other thing is, if you look at the demographic that own those kind of properties, higher income earners, generally when there are periods of economic contraction and unemployment's rising, some of those jobs can sometimes be, the first to go. So people are going to be looking to really take advantage of the government stimulus and really just hold on, not be looking to sell, not be looking to buy. So there's just a lot less appetite for transaction at that end than what there might be at the affordable end.
Yep. Yeah, I've also wondered whether, obviously the people who normally own direct shares and are heavily exposed to the listed property trusts and the share market are often those that are in the more affluent suburbs as well. And when they take a 30% hit overnight to their equity, and who knows where that'll end up, that has a big impact. And I think economists talk about the other side of that, which is when asset values are going up, that people's propensity to spend money is higher in those markets. That often leads those affluent suburbs up higher, I guess, when there's booming asset values. But obviously they're the first ones that come off when asset values go the other way.
Yeah, I remember, that was the kind of flagship story out of the GFC, wasn't it, around the blue chip property. I think 40% of Portsea was up for sale. Quite often because everyone was kind of cross-leveraged and share markets dropped, etc. Forced to sell. For those of you that aren't from Melbourne or don't know Portsea, it's down on the Mornington Peninsula, really prestige suburb.
They won't be selling this time around because all of the skiers that have come back from Aspen are down at the holiday houses in Portsea now.
Indeed. Hey, we've got a couple of questions that have come in, which we might throw to. So, g'day Tom, nice of Cam to throw one in there. Good to see you, Lisa. G'day Sam. So Tom's question first. With the interest rate lever so close to zero, do you think we'll see something like quantitative easing? Do you think that will happen?
You want me to answer that one, Boz?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of your favourites. It's
funny. We were talking about this at our property nights probably 9 months ago in Melbourne and Sydney.
We were.
And it was something to keep our eyes out, but for a very different reason, because Australia was heading towards quantitative easing before this crisis. So we're actually already seeing it. So quantitative easing is essentially when the Reserve Bank starts to buy other debt instruments on the market. So they call it, like what they're doing at the moment, they call it repos. So they're repurchasing bank debt. So to try and put it simply, Australia's banks obviously get money from deposits in Australia. So when you put your money in the bank, that's part of the money that they can then lend out. But they also borrow money from offshore. So when they borrow from offshore, they obviously have to pay interest back to those lenders in whatever country and whatever currency it's denominated in, normally US dollars. So that interest rate's normally higher. So at the moment, the Reserve Bank is stepping in and saying, well, why don't we buy those instead of the banks having to refinance them and pay a higher interest rate? The banks can now borrow from the Reserve Bank at 0.25% interest, pay off those loans they might have been paying 2% interest on. So their actual cost of capital is starting to come down as a result of that. And it's also pushing more money into the economy. I guess the next thing that the Reserve Bank can do is start to buy government debt. So essentially lend money to the government for free, which is what the US Federal Reserve did post GFC and what they're, I guess, looking to do again now. So essentially saying, well, you can start spending money now on all the stimulus that you want, and you're not going to have a big interest bill as a result of it. So it's free money. I think some people call it helicopter money.
That's what Tom called it.
Flies in for a crisis.
Yeah.
So we're already seeing that, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it.
Yeah, cool. Cam's question, I should have known something like this would be coming. Loaded question, guys. Who should buy property now and why? And who should not?
You should, Cam, right now. Look, I think obviously there is a lot of uncertainty, and that makes it hard for some people to act in these times. And obviously there's some industries that are probably harder hit than others. certainly there's industries that are in higher demand than ever. My wife, who's a health professional, is probably working harder now than she has for the last few years, and there's a lot of people in that boat, and other industries. So there's always going to be people who can afford to buy property and act. And I guess the way, and we've spent a lot of time spitballing this, how does this play out? What's likely to happen? As I said earlier, I don't envisage a very strong reduction in house prices, because there's not going to be any forced sellers. There may be some people, when obviously the government opens the doors and says everybody go back to work, there may be a pickup in unemployment at that point in time, and maybe there'll be some people who sell their houses. But most likely, most of the downsizers who have made up a big chunk of sellers for the last few years, they'll just hold off on selling their houses. So there won't be this influx of supply. And what we do know as well is that what comes out of these uncertain times is, and I'll use the government's term of putting the economy on idle. When you want to get out of idle, you really need to put your foot down on the accelerator and feed a lot more gas through the motor if you want to get the car, let's talk cars, if you want to get the car going at speed and build your momentum again. So what they do is they spend money on infrastructure. It's no secret that the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Westgate Bridge, even some of the big buildings in America, Empire State Building and so on, often they were funded by governments and things to help encourage job growth. So what we expect to see is there's going to be a lot of infrastructure getting built as a result of this crisis. Hopefully some of it's renewable energy projects. And they're also going to start trying to stimulate the housing market, because housing market feeds a lot of jobs. You've got builders, you've got tilers, you've got people selling white goods, you've got people furnishing, and then you've people moving, you've got sales agency, all sorts of things. There's it just reverberates through the economy. It's one of the biggest employers, not just directly, but indirectly as well. So the government's going to be pushing stimulus into the housing market and infrastructure markets. So I guess what we know is that coming out the other side, yeah, there might be a little dip, but there's going to be a big, I guess, steep climb out the other side as well.
Yeah, 100%. There are a couple of things that you just touched on. Just a reminder, everyone, if you've got questions, that's what we're here for. We talk property all day long. We can do this anytime, but we're here to answer questions. So jump on, pose anything that you've got. Just before I get to a couple of other ones, some important points that you touched on there, I think, really are around the unemployment stuff. So I like to kind of help people keep a sense of reality on what's happening. And clearly, yes, this is an unprecedented situation. Clearly, there's a lot of negativity and uncertainty out there in the market and amongst people generally. We're being forced to live our life in a very different way than we have ever before. And when you're kind of bombarded by these messages, it's very easy to fall into the mistake that you think 100% of Australians are going to be unemployed in the next 2 weeks. That's not the case. For those that aren't aware, the government are working to a cap of about 13%. Let's say we got to 15%, which was a 100-year high, because I like round numbers. It still means 85% of the Australian working population are employed. Okay, so I think that's something that's generally lost in times of downturn, that the doom and gloom can take over, and that point is missed. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So in terms of tenants' ability to pay the rent, in terms of homeowners' ability to pay their mortgage and so on, yes, there'll be some financial hardship due to COVID-19, and the government and the banks have already been fairly proactive around what that means and some support measures there. But overall, the vast majority of Australia is still going to be employed, albeit working from home or in different conditions. The second point that I wanted to touch on is around that investment and stimulus. And you're exactly right in terms of investment in housing and specifically construction, but also from a confidence perspective. We know that growth phases in asset values are really just a groundswell of consumer confidence. Australia have an affinity with their home and with property. They see it performing well. That perceived wealth effect is obviously a great way to get rebounding in the economy. So, we've been sharing with clients the kind of graphs that we look at and how after any downturn there's a recovery very quickly afterwards, and generally a very rapid recovery. So I guess to answer Cam's point, anyone that's taking a long-term view to their investment, anyone that understands opportunity to be able to get in and follow Warren Buffett's creed, it's not the first time we've mentioned it in this forum, be greedy when people are fearful and fearful when people are greedy. So if you have job security and there are record low interest rates and a property will be paying for itself, don't wait for that phone call when someone tells you, oh, the market's bottomed out, I can get it for 10 grand cheaper in 2 months. Get it when you can, while the lending rules are in place that allow you to do that, because they might change down the track. Get in when you can, hold for the long term, and make sure that you're positioned to take advantage of that recovery. And that's exactly what some of our colleagues in the office have done, going through finance at the moment to add to their portfolio. So hey, Michelle Inger just joined in. Sup, boys? Got to love that millennial language. Question from Sam. This is probably one for you, Louis. How do you think property development projects will be affected by this?
Yeah, certainly in the short term, there's, I guess, with uncertainty, there's going to be less sales. And this is probably something, if I look at one of the other mechanisms for adjusting supply, let's call it a pressure release valve or a pressure cooker situation. So when markets are booming, and obviously if we're looking at housing estates or land estates as one example, it's very hard for land developers to continue to supply the market at the same rate that people are buying. We actually saw, since we came off these recent lows, that as soon as there was confidence returned, all of a sudden the developers were out of titled stock again, and we're looking at 6 to 8 months to get land for our clients that they'll be able to settle on, because it's got to be built still. Now, obviously, when the market turns the other way and there's uncertainty, the first thing the developers do is stop building. So they'll finish the stages they got and they stop producing anymore, which means that supply that was coming through all of a sudden stops, and you don't end up with an oversupply, which is really good. Now, obviously, if you look at apartments as well, apartments have a much longer lead time, but we're coming off the back of a construction boom. It's actually on the tail end. So we're seeing less and less completions coming through in the apartment space now. And then we've got townhouses that sit in the middle, which take about a year to produce. So there are still obviously some townhouses getting built that were sold almost up to a year ago. That's going to obviously come through, and perhaps over the next 6 to 9 months, there's going to be a lot less things starting construction. And as a result of that, that means that in a year's time to a year and a half time, there's going to be a bigger undersupply as a result of this, what will be in a period of underbuilding. And it kind of comes back to that point we were talking about before. As much as the government wants to stimulate activity, they're kind of starting a little bit behind the 8 ball, because activity is coming off so quickly and there's less new supply coming through.
Cool. Okay, Jonathan, question here from Jonathan. So it's really around, and there's a couple of questions here with regards to the rental situation. So Jonathan's question is, the federal government has announced that we're currently unable to evict tenants, but can apply to our lender to freeze mortgage repayments. However, this doesn't help a lot of us who are on interest-only loans, as interest still has to be paid. Any comments on the impact of this? I'm worried that I'll be copying $500 odd dollars a week out of his budget if the tenant can't/won't pay.
Okay, did you want to start with this one, Boz?
Sure. So I guess, Jonathan, the key thing is just because the government's come out and said, yeah, we can't evict tenants, we've got to remember that the comment is specifically around tenants under hardship. So our property management team, in-house, it's business as usual. And if tenants are in a position where they have been affected by COVID-19 financial hardship, then yes, you have that avenue to go to the banks and request those mortgage freezes. If they are in the property and they're still earning money, then the expectation is that rent is still payable. By understanding how to effectively manage this, it's effectively making anyone that believes they have been severely affected, make them jump through some hoops to demonstrate that. And the measures that we're putting in place around that it's basically proving in the too hard basket for people that are just trying to get a free ride. So being proactive and being open, I guess, in that tenant communication is always the first side of things. In dealing with banks, if there's flexibility that is required out there, get on the front foot, be proactive, but show that you've gone through all potential measures with the tenant, and that they are under true hardship.
Just one extra thing there as well. So my understanding is if you've got landlord's rental protection insurance as well, that can step in if there is a genuine hardship case. But for you to be able to claim that insurance, you need to follow a really strict process, which our property management team are doing. So that means essentially you have to go through the normal process that you would go through in terms of serving notice when people go into arrears and demonstrating to the insurer that you've done everything that reasonably required of you as a landlord. And then obviously you can put in the claim for the protection insurance to cover, which is kind of, while they maybe didn't envisage this exact situation, that's why you have landlord's protection insurance.
Yeah, it's a good point. Probably just to draw a parallel to something that we've talked about before in various forums. Cam and I have done a WOD on it, or maybe 2 or 3 WODs on it. And that's, I guess, the benefit of and the value of having a professional property manager. We talk to a lot of people that just think, the property's nearby, I'll manage it myself. When we get into situations like this, and when there's legislation and compliance, etc., in processes that need to be followed and executed, this is really where someone that's qualified in this patch is worth their weight in gold to be able to guide you through that kind of scenario. G'day, Trevor. Good to see you. Good to see you online. I think we've probably covered that. Your question around how you see the situation playing out re tenants. One thing I will add just on that, I guess, comes back to the investment strategy that we look at. So a simple comparison I did for a client today, let's say that there are 2 properties. Let's say one's a blue chip apartment. You've got an expensive purchase price. You've got a relatively expensive rent, and maybe, 2 professionals living together as housemates, for example. So for all the reasons that we talked about earlier with regards to impact above the median house price, $700-800 a week in rent is not easily accessible, especially if some of these professionals are some of those to be impacted in terms of job loss. And so landlords are exposed with a relatively large mortgage there and a fairly transient potential tenant. If we tend to look at the investment strategy that we talk about, under the median house price, 4-bedroom suburban homes, then effectively what's happening there is we're targeting family tenants, and the tenants generally fall into one of 3 categories. So there's either going to be a single income family. If that's the case, the single income earner is probably going to be above average. And as a result, they're probably going to have a safety net of some cash savings there. Or it might be a 1.5 income family. So if one of the parents or workers there is part of that unfortunate 13% odd that might be unemployed as a result of COVID-19, there's some backup income within the household. And the third scenario is a dual income family that is obviously just a more favourable solution to the 1.5 income family. So prevention's better than cure, and you can build in safety and security and risk mitigation into your investment strategy.
Can I cover 2 extra things, Boz? Sorry.
Yeah,
just
sure.
One on that income, and again, I love maths, and I'll try to make the maths as simple as possible. But there's not that many single income households now, even in Australia's suburbs. There's a lot more that there is at least 1.5 incomes. Right now, because of the JobKeeper allowance, if both parties, even if both members of the family had a cut to their income, they're at least earning $6,000 a month. That's $72,000 a year equivalent. And for household or family type or single family homes, the areas where we focus, that's easily covered by $72,000 a year income. Obviously, if one of them loses their job, doesn't get the JobKeeper, they're entitled to $1,100 per fortnight anyway, under the job seeker allowance, and that's before there's any rental contribution as well. So again, even if you assume that both of them are just getting the job seeker, you're talking about $4,400 per month that they're earning as well. And typical rent might be about $1,500 to $1,600 a month. So that's, I guess, one thing when you really think through these numbers. And as I said, the government, the policymakers have done a great job to put a floor under the Australian economy. Now, people in high income that are taking a massive pay cut, they're probably not thanking the government so much. But that's, I guess, one of the other things I was just going to say was I'm really glad I'm not renting out houses for $1,500 a week to executives, because those executives are all being asked to take a lot of pay cut and share the pain a lot for Australia, and their ability to pay the rent will potentially be hammered for the next 6 months.
Yeah, spot on. So a great question from Lisa here. Lisa, I haven't seen your name before, so welcome along if it's your first time. Do you believe property prices will continue to increase as people may value them more highly, viewing them as a stable capital asset to have at times like these, as everyone needs housing to live in?
All right. So we launched a fund recently, and so this isn't a plug for the fund, but we launched a fund recently about a year ago that's buying residential properties around Australia and building a residential property portfolio. One of the reasons why we launched that fund was due to some evidence coming out of the GFC, not just around house prices in Australia, but also about rents. And I'll, I guess, use the US as an example. So leading into the US, big investors really valued commercial property and industrial property better than residential. What they found in the GFC was that when businesses started to have their incomes cut, they couldn't pay the rent, vacancies in office buildings went through the roof, retail vacancies went up, industrial vacancies went up, and then they all started renegotiating their rents down. At the same time, fewer houses were getting built and more people were competing for the rental properties that were in the market. And as a result of that, rents went up. So what they realised, all these big institutions, and we're talking about pension funds with like hundreds of billions of dollars to invest, they realised that residential is actually the more stable asset class. And they started pumping their money into the residential market, and that pushed up asset values. So absolutely, we think coming out the other side of this, there's going to be, in Australia, a similar focus on residential properties as investors start to realise from a risk weighting, residential property far exceeds others. And to be honest, coming into this market and this obviously the impacts, particularly on commercial property rents, and to speak bluntly, I don't think office buildings will recover as well as retail buildings, because retail shops will fill up again. But office buildings, now that we all know we can do Zoom meetings for our Facebook Live meetings, a lot of office buildings are going to be half vacant even after this, and their rents are going to come down. So there's going to be a bigger push into residential markets as a bit of a safe haven. Yeah,
I'd add to that you talked about the share market before and how property's linked. There's no doubt that there's an inflow of capital into property, the safe haven. If you're interested, Lisa, I interviewed Dr. Andrew Wilson last weekend. Dr. Wilson is he's a property chief economist. He's held that position at Australian Property Monitors and at Domain historically. So he's a very well-credentialed, well-sought-after speaker in the media on the property markets and the associated economics of that. Next Thursday, the 9th of April at 12:30, we're actually playing segments of that interview and providing some commentary in terms of what it means for investors and how they can prosper through times like this by understanding the fact rather than the hysteria. So if anyone watching wants to join in on that, just go to the OpenCorp website, opencorp.com.au. Up in the top menu, click on webinar and just register your details. We've had over 1,500 register in the last 3 days, so clearly there's an appetite to understand some fact, and looking forward to sharing that with you. But one of the things that I took out of the interview with Andrew Wilson was what happened to the US stock market through the post-GFC timeframe through today compared to the Australian stock market. and then what that means for the Australian property market moving forward. So I had to go back to these numbers because I'm a property expert, not a share expert, but basically it took the Australian Stock Exchange until the 30th of July last year. So only 9 months ago did it exceed the pre-GFC high. So effectively over the last 11 and a half years, there was about a 4% increase in the Australian stock market. Okay. What's relevant about that is that the only government stimulus that was required or provided as a result of the GFC was KRUD's $900 plasma TV donation grant that everyone got, that had a taxable income under 90K, I think it was from memory. Compare that to the US stock market, and there was massive increase in the Dow Jones over that same time frame. The low during the GFC was on the 5th of March 2009, where it was just below 6,600, and in the middle of January this year it was actually 29,500. So a 5-fold increase, or a 500% growth relative to 4% in the Australian market, right? So significant growth purely as a result of all of that extra government stimulus and money in the economy. So Lisa, your question is perfect around, we want to be mitigating our risk, which we've talked about through the downturns, but make no mistake, this thing will blow over at some point in the future. It won't be around forever. And Australian property markets recover, and they are a focus area for the government. There's no way that the 200 billion odd of government stimulus circulated into the economy through these stimulatory measures just announced in the last 2 weeks won't have an inflationary impact on property into the future on the other side of COVID-19. So hopefully that helps with a bit of data to support your question there. Tom's back again. Does that mean? Oh, Tom. So Tom was the one that asked about the, I guess, being out of pocket if the tenant can't pay the rent. So Cam's made a good point. So effectively, what they're doing is just capitalising those interest repayments. It's not like 3 months off or whatever it might be. So it does add to the loan amount, but clearly that interest is still going to be tax deductible when rent comes back. Given where interest rates are at, the property will still be cash flow positive. So you'll be able to make that back pretty quickly. Far more importantly, given what I've just mentioned, be able to hold your property, through to the long term into the future to benefit from that capital gain. Jonathan, the US doesn't, but the US market doesn't pay dividends like ours. Need to add about 5%. Okay, so I need to add about 5% to my figures. No dramas. If we take a 5% rate compounding over a 12-year period, that'd get you to about 100%. The difference was 500%. So clearly, large scale, like for like, the US is still well above where the Australian stock market was. Glad you're enjoying it, Lisa. Keep the questions coming, guys. That's what we're here for. Want to be able to give you the kind of answers to the information that you're after. If we haven't got any others, I'm just looking at the various things that I've been asked over the last week on the board here. Matt, economic stimulus opportunities. Maybe you talked about kind of what's happened historically around how the government have invested in property as far as stimulus is concerned. Yep. Do you want to just maybe elaborate on that and which parts of the market that they target and why? You mentioned construction before. Just elaborate a bit on that based on your experience. And I guess what I'm specifically getting at is through the GFC, you were running close to $2 billion worth of land holdings as the general manager of P2, who are the third biggest landholder in Australia. So you've kind of seen this on the ground specifically. Yep. Anything else that you can share there?
Yeah, okay. Well, just on that last one, probably case in point. So when I was at Peat Limited, probably just before, it was one of the last things I did there before we got OpenCorp off the ground, was on a land estate that was landlocked, and we couldn't actually start the project. And through the Housing Affordability Fund, which KRUD announced, I think they made, I can't remember if it was about $100 million or a little bit more, they said is available for, I guess, nation building projects. And they ended up allocating $10 million to help a developer to build, which was Peat Limited, build a bridge over a railway line to open up 1,000 lots of development that we could then start putting onto the market. They were doing that all over the country, and trying to find opportunities where they could stimulate local markets by putting money in strategically in a way that was going to free up housing supply and free up construction. So that was one big thing. And obviously at the same time, it was, I guess, coming off the back of a period where developers had pretty much tried to reduce their titled stock to almost zero. So any new sales that you could get in a housing estate was going to lead to civil construction, to housing construction, and so on. We've also seen, obviously, for about the last 20 years, the first homeowners grant, which you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but the first homeowners grant pretty much came in to try and stimulate construction activity to get the economy boosted again. Was it a touch over 20 years ago? Is it 90s?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder about how old I was, mate. Back in, I took advantage of what was $7,000 back then to buy my first property in 2001. So it came in, I guess, in response to the Asian financial crisis. To put that in perspective, that was 1997 to 1999. International stock markets lost about 60% of their value compared to the 25 to 30% currently with this one. So some good perspective there. But yeah, it came in that long ago. And specifically with the GFC, it was a $32,000 first home builder's boost, if you like. So from memory, the first homeowners grant was $18,000 for an established property, which was pretty much, stamp duty.
Yeah.
Back on 2009's prices, 2010 prices. But you got a significant extra kicker to actually build a house. So given that people were only paying stamp duty on land, then there was actually a large net wealth effect there in terms of contribution provided to people to, again, stimulate construction and the economy there.
Yeah, without knowing the dates, but if you think about negative gearing, I know it's a dirty word. Negative gearing was, again, introduced by a government who wanted to stimulate investment activity and create jobs, as was the capital gains tax deduction or reduced amount for holding assets for over a year, because, again, the government wanted to stimulate new asset purchases that led to job creation. And obviously, if you go all the way back to the Great Depression or even post-Spanish flu, again, there were lots and lots of activities that were funded by government to stimulate activity in the economy.
Yeah, cool. And that's one thing that Andrew Wilson was able to shed extensive light on. So again, webinar next Thursday, 12:30. Tune in. You'll get the lowdown from the expert, and the expert is him, not me. So in terms of other questions that we're just actually posting the details for that webinar. So click on the link in the comments section as a shortcut. So Rod's got a question. Hyperinflation coming? ? Anything that you wanted to add on that before a couple of finance questions?
Yeah, wow. This is right up my alley. So over the last month, I've read quite a lot of reports, including reports written for the Federal Reserve and the EU regarding hyperinflation and other things like that resulting from big market shocks and corrections. There's also a couple of ANU professors, Australian National University professors, who wrote a report about 6 years ago on modern monetary theory, which kind of ties a lot of this stuff together. What they actually found was that I guess when you go back historically, some of the hyperinflation, so if you look post Spanish flu, the mortality rate went up by a factor of 5 as a result of the Spanish flu. So obviously when the average life expectancy was about 55 years, so when you have a lot of people dying, 5 times as many as normal, that has a huge impact on your working population. And as a result of that, they saw basically huge wage inflation resulting from the Spanish flu, because there were fewer workers in the economy. Obviously, fast forward 10 years through the 30s, there was hyperinflation in some markets. That was largely because of that. I mentioned earlier about that negative debt spiral, where debt holders or lenders were selling assets, which was forcing down the price of those assets, which meant that nobody wanted to buy assets. So people stopped buying, they were hoarding money. And because they were hoarding money, there was none flowing through the economy. So governments were printing more and more and more of the money. So that resulted obviously in that hyperinflation at that time. Now, modern monetary theory actually looks more at what's happening at the moment. Even though this was written 6 years ago, the professors predicted that governments and central banks would start to work in tandem at the next crisis. And this was kind of looking, I guess, at the GFC as a case study. And what they predicted would happen was that central banks would start printing money. And as long as there wasn't a scarcity of resources, as in scarcity of labor or scarcity of actual resources to buy, then it shouldn't lead to hyperinflation. And certainly not if all countries are doing it at the same time, because if me and Bozza have our own currencies and we both decide to double how much of our currency we got, we're both just as rich as we were beforehand. Neither of us has devalued our currency. So what's happening at the moment is obviously central banks are printing money. They're then lending it to banks to help pay off loans from overseas, whose own central banks are probably doing the same thing. Pretty soon they're going to start lending money to the government at almost no interest. Over the next few years, that may potentially turn into central banks holding equity on their balance sheet from, entities like banks and different things. Again, I think the Federal Reserve has had a heap of tools they've used in the last few years, even potentially, the next time around, if they have to step in and buy a bank or buy shares in banks, then that's obviously something that they'll consider. The hypothesis goes that at the end of it all, everybody just forgives the central banks for having printed all this money because all of the countries have done exactly the same thing. So is it likely that we're going to lead to hyperinflation? I don't think so. I think the stats and the feedback that they get from data these days means that they've got their finger on the pulse a lot more than they had 100 years ago and 90 years ago, when they'd print money and it would take them a year to work out whether it was having a positive or a negative effect. It's an interesting world we live in, but I certainly expect interest rates are going to stay low for a really long time, because we also saw that after the GFC, once quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve was doing, once QE2 or QE3 was wrapped up and they said, let's start to unwind this, they had a real hard time of putting interest rates up. So they kind of had to creep them up over years and never quite got to normalised interest rates again.
Yeah, good point. So I think talking of interest rates, that's one of the big opportunities right now. Take it as a direct call to action for anyone that hasn't reviewed their mortgage in the last 6 to 12 months. That's first port of call, 9 a.m. tomorrow morning is understand what your capacity to refinance and take advantage of the record low interest rates is. And Mark's got a question here. Hi, Boz and Matt. Can you advise if the banks are open for business? I'm hearing that finance is tough to obtain for refinancing. Thanks. I might take that, Louis, as a first step, and you can chime in. Yeah, we're definitely seeing that the banks are open for business. Their response times, due to everyone getting pretty smart and wanting to make sure that refinances get done, especially if they have risk around their job, it's done before any potential job losses happen, and people just wanting to take advantage of the current climate. Banks have been overloaded, especially when not only are they offering record low interest rates, but quite often there are several $1,000s as a kicker to refinance to a new bank. So clearly supply and demand, right? Demand is high. The available workforce hasn't grown exponentially with it. So you need to be patient. Response times are longer, but from what we're seeing and from what our broking team and contacts are telling us, there are absolutely opportunities out there to refinance for sure.
Yeah, just on that as well. A good friend of mine is the head of risk at one of the major banks in Australia. I was talking to him earlier in the week. They received a letter from APRA last Friday saying, please be lenient with borrowers, particularly if they're trying to settle a purchase. We want them to proceed. We want to obviously keep things moving through. So it's amazing how much it's changed. And again, this is probably lessons learned from the GFC. They want to keep the economy functioning as normally as possible. And that obviously means keep property transactions happening, keep refinances happening. And it actually blew me away as well, Boz, that I was talking to Amanda, one of obviously in our finance broking
Amanda's
team.
Been on one of these before, so
yeah, that we had a client recently refinance, say $5,000 a month in their repayments in the last month. I think that settled. It's incredible to save what's that $60,000 a year in interest repayments just by asking a question. The broker say, "Oh, what else is available to me at the moment?"
Yeah.
And you think about the compound effect of that over a 30-year mortgage. I mean, even without compound benefits, that's $1.8 million in saved interest over 30 years. Just mind-boggling, I guess, what deals are available at the moment when you know where they are.
Absolutely. So maybe, what are the steps that, or what are the steps that someone needs to take, or how do they go about it if refinancing is what they want to do?
Again, if you're already working with somebody who you know and trust, in terms of that finance broking who's a specialist who has access to a lot of products, then absolutely ask them a question. If you don't already have somebody and you've just got a single relationship maybe with your bank, then obviously our finance brokers would love to be able to talk to you and see what they can do. They can normally respond really quickly in terms of giving you a sense of where it might be or what your options are. And then I guess it's up to you to do with that information what you want. But yeah, it's a lot simpler. And I know if I go back even just 10, 11 years, the first property that my wife bought on her own, she was petrified, and like dealing with the bank was so hard. It was like the sort of almost the death of her ever investing again. And these days, it's a matter of you once you've got a good broker, we lean on our broker relationship so much. We just say, this is what we want to do. We get the paperwork back, and just go from there.
Yeah. So just to, I guess, formalise that for people, the first thing is to understand your borrowing capacity. So a bank will only let you refinance if you've got the capacity to meet their servicing criteria with all the buffers built in and so forth. That's about a 10-minute exercise that we can help you with. So it doesn't involve an application for credit. It's not a submission to the bank to find this out. It's purely kind of a sense check to start with. And that can give you a good indication on where you sit, and we can get into the nitty-gritty after that if we think it's something that will work for you, and get into more detail there. So as a first step, go back to your existing broker if you've got a good relationship there. If you haven't heard from your broker for 12 to 24 months, clearly there are opportunities on the table that you could be taking advantage of. Reach out if you need some help from Open Finance. We can do that. Hi Daisy. Hi guys. Do you think actually this is an opportunity to do investment property? Clearly we're biased. I might explain it like this, Daisy, and we put this in a video to clients a couple of weeks ago. With the benefit of hindsight, would you have bought a property where you lived 30 years ago? I'm yet to meet someone that says no when I ask them that question. Okay. But what if I was to tell you 30 years ago, before you bought that property, that over the next 30 years, you'd have to endure the recession that we had to have in 1991. Not long after that, we'd have the Asian financial crisis that I mentioned before, where international stock markets lost 60% of their value, devaluing of currency, etc., etc. A couple of years after that was finished, we had September 11. Then we had the GFC, and then in the best part of 10 years after that, we had things like swine flu and SARS and Zika virus, and we also had a 3-year period of really tough lending restrictions where a lot of people couldn't borrow. knowing all of that was coming over the next 30 years, the number of people that actually bought or would have bought 30 years ago shrinks dramatically. So what I'd encourage you to do, we often talk about property being a long-term investment. COVID-19 won't be here forever. Hopefully it probably won't even be around next year, okay? But when you look at the fundamentals of supply and demand, money in the economy, all of the things that we've talked about, ongoing population growth, etc. I'm not saying it's going to grow in the next week or two. Who knows? We don't have that crystal ball, but when you take a long-term strategy and when you buy when you can, that's the learning to take out of the last 3 years, because on a weekly basis, we talk to people that regret that they could have bought before the lending restrictions came in. They didn't. They thought, oh, it'll be right. Then the lending restrictions came in with next to no notice. They lost that opportunity, and prices have gone from here to here in the last 3 years. So don't try and make money in the next 2 weeks. Don't be speculative. Understand it's long term. Buy when you can. Markets will cycle, but the fundamentals remain. Looks like there's a bit of banter going on here in the background. Stephen said, I watched last month's Q&A and Cam looked like he was off his face and could barely stay awake. Not a good look for a professional outfit. Cam's up at 4:30 most mornings, and he's got 4 kids, so if it gets to 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock and he's running on empty, that's probably why. But he's looking pretty. He's looking pretty fit. All good. We're just having a bit of fun. There's a question here from James. G'day, James. Thanks for your input. What do you think will happen to the 1.2 million people working in construction if we see people defaulting on their mortgage and housing starts to crash? I don't think we realise how much our economy has relied on the housing market constantly rising. I think we probably covered a large chunk of that earlier on. Maybe the only thing that I'll add to what we mentioned earlier is that in terms of how construction is viewed currently, the Master Builders Association of Australia came out late last week and said that construction is deemed to be an essential service. Clearly, it is a major employer around Australia, and albeit with some adjusted measures, social distancing, all the responsible social behaviour that's going on right now, construction is moving forward, and that's the view based on what we know today. I think the defaulting part, James, maybe just go back to what we talked at length about earlier after the session, but we talked about how that risk will be significantly reduced to the government stimulus and a floor under the housing market. Question here from Rod. Have you guys spoken about the potential retirement opportunities on those with large portfolios just with the interest rates coming down? You got any views on that, Louis?
So just trying to understand the question. So with interest rates coming down, so I'll just think out loud. Obviously, that means the income that they're going to be generating from savings will be a lot less. Yep. And obviously, if they're holding large portfolio, I assume we're talking about a large portfolio of residential property. So, look, I guess without having a crystal ball, I mean, I think there's logic that you can apply to what's going to happen. It's just cause and effect. So what's likely to happen after this crisis? Obviously, governments will spend money. They'll keep interest rates down. So the savings rate and the income you get from deposit to the bank aren't going to go up anytime soon. But the government's going to try and stimulate the economy by putting money into the economy, pushing up asset prices, which means if you're holding assets like property, like residential property, there's a good chance that over the next 2-3 years, you're going to see growth at a faster pace than what you would probably get from having money in the bank anyway. And over that period, then the economy starts to normalise again. As I said earlier, if you look at the US, after they started quantitative easing, it's very hard to unwind. It takes years, might take a decade for interest rates to get back up even to 1.5% to 2%, as it did in the US. I think it took about 9 years to get back to 2.5%. So, yeah, I think I think that's kind of one thing all Australians, particularly nearing or at retirement age, have to understand is they're not going to get the same amount out of their out of cash savings that they would have otherwise. So I imagine that means that they're probably looking at where they have their money and assets parked.
Yeah, just to give you kind of an actual example, I caught up with a client today. Both earn 90K, give or take, so not massive incomes and massive tax benefits factored into this. But with a cash deposit, let's call it round number 100 grand to make it easy, they're earning about 1% at best on that, give or take. By putting not even all of that 100,000 as the deposit down into a property investment, the property was cash flow positive on inflated interest rates and conservative rents to the tune of $2,500 a year. So they're basically getting a 2.5% or 2.5 times better return in terms of cash flow by that cash being into a property versus it being in the bank. They're still leaving themselves a buffer, and any growth over the future is growth for free and free upside. So yeah, if that helps, Rod, with your question, the
just on that, Boz, one quick one. Where are you seeing interest rates at the moment?
In terms of what point?
Yeah, what are people borrowing at?
Yeah, so if we're talking about interest only for investment, 3.6 to 3.7, up to maybe 4%-ish for 90%. So those figures I just talked about are on a 4.5% rate, so plenty of buffer factored in. But yeah, well under 4%, more like mid threes.
Yeah. Excellent. And yeah,
for owner occupiers, even low threes and into the twos in some cases.
Yeah, and you don't need to do hard maths to know if you're paying under 4% and you're getting 4.5 to 5% from a tenant on 100% of the value, and you're only paying interest on a percentage of the value, then you're going to come out in front, aren't you?
Yep, exactly right. So a question here from Tom. We've been going for over an hour, guys. So let's keep the questions coming if you want us to answer anything. Another question from Tom: is a low Australian dollar good or bad for property investment? I'm not sure how much of the materials come from overseas for new builds, and if we look cheap, will overseas investors swoop in and buy? That's a good question for you. The one part that I'll contribute before I throw to you, mate, is with regards to materials. So we've been looking at that pretty closely. Between 80 and 90% of building materials are sourced locally. The kind of materials that have been challenging in terms of supply for builders to get have been mostly the doorware, the tapware, the fixtures and fittings that come out of China. The feedback from builders, though, is that those Chinese factories are back up and running and operational. The delays are 2 to 3 weeks, which is ship quarantining upon arrival in Australia based on border control. Clearly those things are required towards the back end of the build process. So with some fairly basic planning, not a risk that should be blowing out build timeframes.
No, and in terms of lower Australian dollar, if you think firstly about its effect on the economy, I mean, the RBA has been trying to get Australian dollar down for the last year, because obviously if they're pushing the Australian dollar down, our exports become cheaper by comparison to everything else or other countries. So obviously that means our iron ore, our gas exports, all those things become more attractive, especially if they're reporting profits in Australian dollars. The other thing is that our property prices, even if they don't go down to an offshore buyer or to somebody who's been earning money overseas and is moving to Australia, obviously once we get through this, eventually our immigration is going to pick back up again and potentially even be at a higher rate than it used to be. Certainly, I imagine there's a lot of people who have been living in parts of China that probably want to get out of there before the next big health crisis comes through. So obviously getting to Australia and bringing their money across will buy them a lot more, which means that their borrowing capacity and their purchasing power will improve, which obviously has an inflationary effect on house prices as well.
Yeah, indeed. Just on that, I actually took a call. One of my brothers lives in Dallas with his family. He's been over there for 20 years. He's not having a fun time. He's a stockbroker, but he rang me just politely inquiring when the dollar was at 57 cents. I think he saw that there was some upside that could be made by having exposure to Australian property. So we were trying to get him to come back with his family because we'd like to see more of them, but he was thinking from a financial point of view. Jonathan asked the question, do you think the banks will pass on the full 25 basis points from the RBA cut on the 19th of March? We definitely haven't heard anything about that yet. I think everyone's kind of preoccupied with government stimulus and COVID-19. They've probably just swept that one under the carpet, but anything to add on that?
No, I'm pretty sure they did put in some of the rate cuts. What they tried to do was adjust rates for medium long-term loans, and they've obviously played with it for different markets, whether you're an investor or owner occupier. They've tried to do a bit of product positioning, I think, and I expect that's going to happen again if there is any downward pressure on their interest rates. They're obviously now starting to compete for business in a way that's kind of smart, because previously they all looked the same, and the big four kind of were rolling out the same interest rates almost as each other for the same products.
Yeah, cool. And Amanda's just, we spoke about Amanda before. Amanda's leads our broking team at Open Finance. She has been on the Q&A sessions before. She's just posted there with regards to some of the where the actual rates are for different things, especially with some low fixed rates. At this point, it's probably relevant to say that everyone's situation is going to be different. That links into one of Daisy's questions, which is, do I think it's a good idea to go with investment property, or should I take an opportunity on share market price when right now it's down? Which one is to take this situation into the opportunity? So that's the kind of scenario, Daisy. Shoot an email to info@opencorp.com.au. That'll land with our team. One of our team can get in touch and understand a bit more of your individual situation to be able to provide some guidance there, specifically on what it looks like. So if you are wanting to understand more about what your borrowing capacity looks like and potential refinance options, or look at your individual situation, that email address again, info@opencorp.com.au. Alrighty, I think we're pretty much out of questions. We've been going for about 70 minutes. Might wrap up at that point. Thanks everyone for your input. Hopefully you've found some value. First Thursday of every month. We'll be back again in May, and again, if you want to get some really deep market insights with Andrew Wilson and me. Final reminder: next Thursday, 12:30 p.m. Everyone's working from home. Grab a cup of coffee and your lunch. Tune in and register for the webinar at opencorp.com.au under the webinar tab. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.